killer in the rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house. A small, flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and it called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived. and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet. But they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the Rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared. My hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. Home alone and an uninvited guest. George lived alone in her house in a small Michigan town on weekends. She often came here to escape the urban lifestyle she had grown up in and had grown tired of. She enjoyed the peaceful countryside, but George's house was like something out of a horror movie, an old house with overgrown grass and peeling paint. One Friday, George had just arrived home. She sat on the couch, her eyes glued to the TV, relaxing after a long week at work. As she flipped through channels, her peace was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. At first, George ignored it, thinking it wasn't important. But the knocking grew louder and more persistent. George opened the door and saw a man standing there, holding a clipboard. She immediately assumed he was selling something. He asked her if she was satisfied with her security system. George replied that she didn't have one, but wasn't too concerned, joking that no one would break into such an ugly house. He then went on to describe all the recent break-ins in the area, which, honestly, George had never heard of. He then asked who George lived with, and she accidentally blurted out that she lived alone. Although she wasn't interested, he persistently asked for her phone number at least. He said he'd follow up in a few weeks, and even offered free installation on the spot. After some back and forth, George agreed since it sounded like a good deal. He thanked her and left. Later, George went to the kitchen to start cooking dinner, and then continued watching movies in the living room. She binge-watched for hours on the couch until around 11 p.m., when there was a knock at the door. This time, it was hard to ignore. George glanced at the clock, worried. 11 p.m. was far too late for anyone to knock on the door, especially since she wasn't close with her neighbors. The knocking persisted. She cautiously approached the door and asked who was there, but there was no response. Thinking quickly, she lied that she had a gun, though she didn't. She hoped it would scare them off. For a moment, the knocking stopped, but then her phone rang. When she answered, the voice on the other end claimed to be from 911, saying there was a dangerous intruder in her house, and they needed to come in to handle him. They said they were standing at her door, but she was skeptical. George looked around and saw nothing unusual. Meanwhile, the knocking outside continued relentlessly. She unlocked one of the latches and hesitantly placed her hand on the doorknob. But before she could react, the door somehow opened. It wasn't a police officer like the caller claimed. It was him, the delivery man from earlier. His demeanor was erratic and strange, his eyes wide, no longer resembling a salesperson. Then he said,
"You shouldn't let yourself be tricked like that. Your house really is run down, but to let your guard down like this? I think you need me."
He smiled cheerfully, as if nothing had happened before. George had no idea what the hell was going on. He started telling her that his car had broken down, and he asked for a cup of hot water, saying he'd leave right after. But his expression was off. It was bad enough that she really thought he might be a burglar. Reluctantly, she went to get the water while he sat waiting in the living room. After finishing the water, he left, thanking her for the drink. She sighed in relief and moved to close the door. But as she tried to close it, his arm blocked it. A strong shove flung the door back open. She asked,
"Did you forget something? Don't joke like that."
but no, he was slowly advancing, grinning maliciously. Instinctively, George backed away and ran into the kitchen. He chased her into the kitchen, laughing gleefully.
You should have been more careful. Watching you scared is so entertaining.
Then he immediately went to the knife rack and grabbed one. He swung it through the air, narrowly missing, but it grazed her sleeve, leaving George injured and in pain. Panicked, unsure of what he wanted, she ran to the front door. But when she got there, George tripped and fell while he stood over her, knife in hand. Then her eyes caught sight of a mini fire extinguisher near the door. She grabbed it and sprayed it into his face, disorienting him. She grabbed the keys hanging nearby, ran outside, got into her car, and sped off in terror. Once she reached a safe distance, she called the real police to track him down. He was eventually apprehended, and it turned out the man wasn't a random intruder, but someone who had been stalking her. He had faked the 911 call, knowing she would open the door. That night would stay with her forever, but she remained grateful to be alive. George swore to herself that no one would ever trick her into opening the door again. The nightmare trip on Christmas Day. In December, my girlfriend Charlotte and I were driving to the Poco Mountains. We had rented a small wooden cabin that looked super cozy, decorated with Christmas ornaments, and had a beautiful view. That night, there was a snowstorm forecast, so we left a bit earlier to have time to buy groceries. After that, we headed straight to the cabin. The house was surrounded by forest, and we had to make several trips from the car to bring everything inside. I did the usual things, like checking the fridge, turning on the TV to see if there was cable or Netflix, and looking out all the windows to make sure everything was fine. Then there was a basement for recreation. I went down to check it out. It was quite large compared to the size of the house. It felt detached from the cabin, dark, and rather chilly. Then there was a knock on the front door. I hurried upstairs to answer it. I was surprised and confused to see a guy who looked like he was in his late 40s. He wore gray sweatpants and a tattered tan jacket. He smiled at me and asked,
"How's everyone doing?"
I started asking if he was the owner. He introduced himself as Tom and said he ran the place with his brother. Tom said he lived just up the road if my girlfriend and I needed anything. At that moment, I found it a bit odd that he knew I was with my girlfriend. He left quickly. We continued watching a Christmas movie and enjoying the quiet, but an uneasy feeling started to creep in. When I went to shower, I was startled as the water suddenly turned ice cold. I quickly got out and texted Mike, the cabin owner, asking if there was an issue with the water heater. Mike replied a while later, saying he'd send someone to check it the next day. Around midnight, we woke up to loud banging on the front door. Charlotte shook me awake, terrified. I said I'd check to see who it was, but she was terrified, begging me to stay in the room and keep quiet. The knocking continued, growing louder and more persistent, before suddenly stopping. We sat upright in silence for a few minutes, whispering to each other. I went to lock the bedroom door to feel safer. After a while of staying alert, we eventually fell asleep. The next morning, there was a lot of snow outside, and it was a cloudy, gloomy day. I stepped out to clear the snow off my car. While doing so, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow. They circled around the house. I heard footsteps approaching, and I saw Tom suddenly appear. He said,
"Is everything okay?"
I started telling him about what we had experienced the previous day. He even laughed at me, saying I was being paranoid. and assured me he would help check the water heater, which we had complained about earlier. Tom offered to check the water heater. Reluctantly, I agreed to follow him to the basement. At that moment, I texted Mike that Tom was here and helping me check the water heater, but Mike hadn't replied yet. Once in the basement, Tom said he needed to grab some tools from the house next door. But then, he slammed the door shut, startling me, and I had no idea what was happening. Then I heard the click of a lock, indicating the door had been locked. Before I could react, my phone buzzed with a message from Mike. He texted, "Is Tom the plumber's name?" I replied, "No, he said he's your brother." Mike then replied, "No, who is this person?" Frozen with fear, I sent a voice message. "Help me. He's here, I'm trapped, and my girlfriend is in danger." Just then, Charlotte's scream rang out. I panicked, banging on the door. A moment later, the door finally opened. In a panic, I ran upstairs and saw Tom restraining Charlotte, covering her mouth. She saw me, and while he was distracted, hit his hand. In pain, he pushed her away. At that moment, I felt a surge of strength to protect my girlfriend. I charged at him and punched him in the face, causing him to collapse temporarily. During that moment, we managed to escape the house with great difficulty, running through the snow to reach our car and driving away immediately. When I called Mike for help, he immediately contacted the police. Mike apologized for the unfortunate events and called to report the man named Tom, who had impersonated his brother. The story behind Tom's behavior involved a psychological trauma from his past. His partner had abandoned him for an extended period. He began impersonating the homeowner's brother to easily infiltrate couples' lives, creating a sense of familiarity, then stalking and observing them when they weren't paying attention, ultimately plotting to harm and separate them. Charlotte and I finally understood the reason behind Tom's behavior, and although we escaped the danger, we could never forget the terrifying hours we endured. The obsession with the house by the quarry. Tom's family moved to an old house near a quarry in Minnesota. He had a new job in a small town, and his family would stay there for a few weeks. Boxes were scattered across the hardwood floor. Emily sat by the fireplace, arranging her stuffed animal collection. Evi, his wife, sat in a chair, sipping tea and watching their daughter. Meanwhile, Tom was organizing tools in the corner of the room. But sometimes, the silence in the house was too heavy. The creaking of the wooden floor beneath their feet sounded louder than it should. The house fell silent, save for the faint howling wind outside. Tom lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His gaze turned toward the window. For a moment, Tom saw her, a shadowy figure of a woman with milky white eyes staring at him through the glass. Tom sat up in alarm. When he looked back, she was gone. Then Emily screamed. They rushed to her room. She was sitting on her bed, her tiny body trembling, her wide eyes filled with tears. She pointed under the bed and said,
"She's under the bed, the woman with the white eyes. She wants me to hide under the bed."
Tom bent down and looked under the bed, but saw nothing. They reassured Emily that it was just a nightmare, but something about her description made them uneasy. To ease her fear, the next day, they installed a small hidden camera in her room. What they discovered that night sent chills down their spines. On the screen, they watched her fitful sleep together. Hours passed without incident, until, suddenly, the blanket began sliding off her as if pulled by invisible hands. The little girl's small body shifted toward the edge of the bed, slowly as if being dragged. Then suddenly, she was yanked down violently. She fell off the bed and was pulled under it, disappearing from their view. They rushed to her and found her curled up on the floor, crying in fear. Tom opened the live feed on his phone. On the screen, a faint silhouette of a girl was hiding under the bed. She was crawling, hiding under Emily's bed. Her hollow, black eyes stared directly at the camera. Emily's fear was unrelenting. She clung to her parents and refused to be alone. They decided to stay in the living room that night. As they sat on the sofa, the lights began to flicker. Then a cold hand brushed against Evi's cheek. She screamed in terror, but when she turned around, nothing was there. Emily screamed as one of her toys rolled into the room and stopped at her feet. Tom realized everything was spiraling out of control. He needed to grab the car keys from the bedside table. When he reached the bedroom, in the mirror, he saw her standing there, grinning maliciously. Tom grabbed the keys and ran back to the living room. They rushed to the front door, but it slammed shut as they reached it. The back door was their only chance. As they ran through the kitchen, glass shattered all around them. Everything seemed to be trying to stop them from leaving. With a desperate kick, the door burst open. As they got outside, Emily pointed toward the house. In the upstairs window, she, the figure with sunken eyes, was watching them leave. They got to the car and quickly drove away. They sat in silence, knowing they would never return to that house. The house on the edge of the quarry remains, holding its secrets. For the family, it is a memory they will never escape. The mysterious curse of donuts. Moving into a new house is always unsettling. John and his wife, Lisa, had just moved into an old house next to an abandoned Dunkin' Donuts, left in ruins nearly a decade ago. They had no idea the house harbored such a dark history. The fire had destroyed the building, leaving behind charred ruins and rumors of hauntings, which gave the area an eerie reputation. However, they never believed in such tales. At first, they enjoyed their new home and gradually adjusted to the quiet neighborhood. However, things quickly turned strange when a mysterious box of donuts began appearing on their doorstep every morning. It was a plain cardboard box, unmarked and without any notes, containing a dozen perfectly arranged donuts. John was suspicious, thinking it was some kind of prank, but Lisa, on the other hand, was delighted. She loved sweets, especially donuts. He brought the box inside, and Lisa eagerly opened it.
Look, they're fresh.
She exclaimed. He frowned.
I don't know. This seems a little strange.
John felt uneasy trusting food from strangers. Despite Lisa's claims that he was overreacting, John threw the donuts away. He didn't want to take any risks, but the next morning, it was back. Another box of donuts. He threw it away again, but the pattern continued. A few days later, a new neighbor moved in and brought them a box of donuts as a gift. John's instincts told him something was off, given the recent events. He gave a weak smile, took it inside, and threw it away. But one day when John came home, he found her eating a donut from the box. She dismissed his concerns with a weak laugh, saying,
It's just a donut.
That night, however, things took a disturbing turn. John woke to the sound of 3 knocks on the window, followed by 2 more. Then it intensified as he heard footsteps in the hallway and a strange bell ringing. It was a soft chime, like a hotel bell ringing. When John asked Lisa if she heard it, she mumbled in her sleep, turning her back to him. Over the next few days, the noises became more frequent. The knocks, footsteps, and bells. They felt like they were living in a nightmare. Lisa began acting strangely, growing distant and staring at the wall. One night, John found her standing completely still in the kitchen.
Lisa, what are you doing?
He asked, but she didn't reply. Suddenly, the same bell rang, and before he could react, she turned to him with a vacant stare and lunged at him with a knife in her hand. John narrowly dodged the knife, staggering backward. He escaped death by a hair's breadth, but Lisa's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Then she charged at him, as though possessed by madness. She began chasing John through the house, as if something was controlling her every move. However, as John reached the front door and flung it open, Lisa suddenly stopped. Her head jerked to one side, her neck twisting unnaturally as she stared at the abandoned Dunkin' Donuts building.
Lisa?
John called out, desperate.
What's happening to you?
But she didn't reply. She just began walking toward the ruins, her steps slow and deliberate. John followed her, keeping a safe distance. The neighbors began stepping out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. An elderly man approached John, his face pale and filled with confusion. He warned John that the building had a dark history. It had burned down 10 years ago, killing 6 people inside. He said, rumors claimed the place was cursed, though no one knew the full story. John looked at Lisa, who continued walking toward the burned ruins, oblivious to everything around her. The entrance was nothing but rubble and charred remains. She stepped inside and headed straight for the old counter. Fearful, John followed her, unable to leave her alone. Lisa bent down and picked something up from the debris. It was a tarnished desk bell, identical to the one John had heard in their house. Lisa placed it on an old countertop and began ringing it repeatedly, as if entranced. The sound echoed through the ruined building, sending a chilling wave through him. Not knowing what else to do, he shakily called the police. When the police arrived, Lisa was still standing there, her face void of expression, ringing the bell like a madwoman. They sedated her and took her away. They admitted her to a mental health facility, but she hasn't responded since. 2 years have passed, and Lisa still hasn't opened her eyes. John can't shake the feeling that the donuts somehow caused all of this. He wishes she had never eaten those donuts that The terror on Christmas Eve. This incident happened on Christmas Eve, the year Lena was 13. Since she only lived with her dad, and her family usually either didn't celebrate or celebrated Christmas late, she was used to this. For Lena, Christmas Eve was just like any other night. Her dad was a doctor, so he always had to be on call at the hospital during Christmas holidays. That night was no exception. He wasn't home. Lena was watching TV when she heard a knock at the door, so she went to see who it was. Her front door had a peephole, making it easy to see who was outside. A man stood outside wearing a Santa Claus suit, holding a bag and smiling, waving at Lena to open the door. But something about him seemed off. He didn't look neat at all. Lena approached the door, but didn't open it. She found it odd that someone dressed as Santa Claus would come to her house, of all the houses in the neighborhood. He said,
Hey kid, it's me, Santa Claus. Let me in, and I'll show you.
Maybe other kids would believe him, but Lena knew he wasn't real. Confused and skeptical, because this had never happened before, Lena refused to open the door. The man insisted, saying he had changed the rules this year to give gifts to kids in the neighborhood. But Lena didn't believe him. Instead, she remembered feeling angry while arguing with him. Lena told him she was calling the police. His smile disappeared, and after that, she didn't hear anything else. To be sure, Lena called the police to report him. Unfortunately, they probably didn't believe her and thought she was just an excited kid, hoping Santa Claus would visit. She only knew how to dial 911 and the house number, since it was the 90S and her dad didn't have a mobile phone yet. Lena could only hope the man wouldn't return. But a few minutes later, someone knocked again. When Lena checked, no one was there. She returned to the Christmas tree to continue decorating and wrapping gifts as a surprise for her dad. Lena turned on the TV to watch Christmas specials, which made her feel less lonely. Suddenly, the power went out, leaving the house in darkness. Lena jumped in fright. Now, the only light in the house came from the battery-operated Christmas tree. Then she heard the back door creak open. From the doorway emerged a dark silhouette, slowly advancing. It was the figure of a man. Lena grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer and shone it towards the figure. The face revealed was his, the man from earlier, leaning close to her with a sinister grin.
Here's your surprise gift, little one.
He sneered. Lena screamed and ran toward the back door, but she couldn't outrun him. He grabbed her hand and yanked her back. Lena sobbed and screamed, begging for mercy, but he showed no remorse. He taped her mouth shut and began tying her up with rope. As her vision blurred, he stuffed her into a large sack he had brought with him and hoisted it over his shoulder. Lena's next-door neighbor, who was walking his dog, happened to see the man. His actions seemed suspicious. The neighbor remembered that Lena lived alone with her father, who was often away, and her father had occasionally asked him to check on her. He cautiously approached with his dog and asked,
What are you doing out here at this hour? Is everything okay?
The man, startled, quickly forced a smile and replied,
Oh, I'm just preparing a surprise for the kids in the neighborhood.
The man hurriedly hid the sack behind his back, stepping away as his eyes darted around. His strange behavior only heightened the neighbor's suspicions. His dog kept barking, as if trying to warn him of something. It was a smart dog, good at sensing trouble. The neighbor noticed the sack behind the man seemed to be moving slightly. Sensing the man was odd, the neighbor remained cautious. He apologized for bothering him and pretended to head back toward his house. He then heard a faint sound resembling crying and immediately knew something was wrong. Without thinking, he rushed toward the man and shoved him hard, causing him to fall onto the grass. The sack fell, and Lena tumbled out onto the grass, her eyes wide with terror. The man tried to flee, but the neighbor quickly pinned him to the ground and held him there until the police arrived. The man remained on the ground, handcuffed and arrested. Lena was safely escorted back home by her neighbor. Her father returned home immediately after hearing the news. That night, Lena learned the true meaning of fear. She hugged her father tightly, knowing she was lucky to have survived a terrifying Christmas Eve. Message on the mirror. Lily was living in an old apartment, a temporary home. The unique feature of the apartment was the mirrors. They reflected every corner of the space. Some were framed with antique designs, while others appeared worn and aged. Although Lily found them beautiful, they sometimes exuded a strange, unsettling feeling. Lily sat on the couch, reading a book. The apartment was enveloped in silence. Suddenly, Lily stopped. She heard footsteps. She sat still, listening. The sound continued, but when she looked around the room, no one was there. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Lily got up and glanced at the mirrors along the hallway. In the dim light, each mirror reflected her image, but with a strange distortion. A slight chill ran down her spine, but she ignored it. Lily stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The overhead light flickered as she washed her face, but she stopped when she saw something strange in the reflection. There was a shadow, resembling a man, pressed against the window. His face was obscured, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. Lily quickly turned around, but the bathroom was empty. A wave of fear washed over her. The unsettling feeling grew stronger. At night, she felt she wasn't alone, as if someone was standing just outside her line of sight, watching her. One night, just before bed, she went to the living room to watch TV. Then the feeling returned. She was tense, filled with fear, unsure if she was imagining it, but she saw it, a hand sliding past the curtain. Lily cautiously stood up and turned to look. The curtain swayed, but there was nothing behind it. Her breathing quickened, and a cold, heavy sensation filled the room. Then suddenly, from behind her, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was unmistakably the figure of a man. He wore filthy, tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. He said nothing, only stared at Lily as if waiting for her to act. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move toward the door. Lily ran down the hallway. She reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. She glanced back to see the man's eyes, filled with amusement, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched her every move. She struggled to open the door, bursting out into the night, gasping for air. Her legs gave out as she stumbled down the stairs. She stood at the building's entrance, breathing heavily, asking for help from those around. They helped her call the police. The police arrived within minutes and stormed into the apartment. She told them about the man, about what she had seen inside, but they seemed skeptical. Everything in the apartment was untouched, and nothing was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The red and blue lights of the police cars flashed across the old building, leaving her alone once again. Lily stood outside, unable to bring herself to go back inside. She looked up at her apartment window, and for a moment, she thought she saw a faint figure standing there. Watching her from behind the glass, she shivered, knowing she couldn't stay there any longer. It was time to pack up and leave for good. A few days later, she returned to the house. Lily stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. She was here one last time to gather her belongings before leaving this strange place forever. Message on the mirror. The hallway seemed darker than before. The dim lights flickered weakly as she walked down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing faintly. Lily paused for a moment before the door, hesitating as her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she slowly opened the door and stepped inside. The familiar chill hit her as she entered the apartment. She was ready to leave this place behind. As she walked through the living room, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors. Her reflection looked almost unfamiliar, distorted by the unease she felt. Lily looked away, trying to focus on packing her belongings. Walking down the hallway, she came across an old mirror covered in dust, one she had never noticed before. It sat at the end of the hallway, almost forgotten beneath its dusty covering. She moved closer to the mirror. It was coated with a thick layer of dust, but something about it drew her attention. Slowly, she pulled the cloth away. She shuddered at what she saw. Written faintly in the dust on the mirror were the words, "Hello," and just below it, "I like you." Lily held her breath as she stared at the mirror. Had it always been there? She tried to reason with herself, convincing herself. It must have been there for a long time. She shook her head, trying to ignore the growing paranoia. Lily went into the bedroom, hastily gathering her belongings to pack and leave. As she passed the bathroom, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She stopped, slowly turning her head to look inside. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The bathroom sink faucet was running. She was certain she hadn't left it on. She cautiously stepped into the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the mirror. A message appeared on the fogged glass. "You are mine." Lily froze in terror. She had heard horror stories about people secretly living in others' homes. Was she unknowingly a victim? Trembling, she reached out to turn off the faucet. Slowly, she extended her hand and touched the surface of the mirror. She was shocked to feel a small latch, and the mirror suddenly moved, swinging open like a door. Lily staggered backward as the mirror revealed a hidden space behind it, larger and darker than she could have ever imagined. Then her heart nearly stopped. A face emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his hair disheveled, his wide eyes and a toothy grin, the shadows seemingly swallowing his body, making him appear as just a floating head. Below, the floor was cluttered with clothes, various trash, and some personal belongings. Panic surged through her. Lily turned, grabbed her keys, and bolted out of the bathroom. Lily burst through the front door of the building. She ran to her car, slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police. The police arrived quickly. The man was eventually caught, still wearing that unnerving, unnatural smile. The police searched the apartment. They discovered a hidden space behind the bathroom mirror containing personal items, canned food, and things Lily recognized as her own. The man had been living there, watching her, moving around the apartment whenever she was out. When they apprehended him, he refused to explain or answer any questions from the police, sometimes sulking, other times aggressive, appearing mentally unstable. Lily felt incredibly lucky that the man was merely an agitated intruder and not a murderer. Otherwise, things could have been far worse. She started the car, glancing at the apartment one last time. Then she drove away, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. The lurking in the middle of the night. This happened to Joy when she was in college. Joy lived alone in her dorm, and it was just an ordinary day like any other. After class, she decided to stop by the nearest grocery store to pick up a few things before heading home. As she walked through the aisles, browsing items, she noticed a strange man lurking in one of them. He was a man with bloodshot eyes and tattered clothes, staring at her from a distance with a strange, unsettling grin. As she continued shopping, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. Joy tried to ignore it and quickly grabbed what she needed before heading to the checkout. But as she reached the checkout, she felt his breath on her neck. He leaned in close and whispered something in her ear, something she couldn't quite make out. Joy quickly paid for her items and rushed to her car in the parking lot. As Joy was about to get into her car, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw it was him. He had come from the store and was now charging toward her, a knife in his hand. Joy threw herself into her car, locking the doors just in time, escaping by mere seconds. He stood outside, pounding on the window, shouting obscenities, but she sped off and called the police once she was safe. The police searched the area, but couldn't find the man. Joy was terrified and couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching her. One night, a violent storm rolled in. Joy struggled to sleep and woke up around 5 or 6 a.m., startled by a particularly loud clap of thunder that shook the house. Then, she noticed a strange shadow. As lightning flashed, she saw the silhouette of a man standing outside her window. His face pressed against the glass, staring at her. It was him, the man from the store. Joy froze in terror. In his hand, he clutched a knife, his gaze fixed on her. With each flash of lightning, the man appeared closer until, suddenly, he vanished along with the storm. Panicked, Joy rushed to check that all the doors were locked. But when she turned back, she saw the man standing in her living room. His terrifying grin widened as he pointed the knife at her and lunged forward, screaming, "You're mine, you're mine." Joy collapsed to the floor, paralyzed with fear, as he climbed on top of her, the blade of his knife slicing through her clothes. Just when she thought it was over, a loud crash echoed through the room, and she saw him collapse to the floor. Then, Joy saw her neighbor. He had tackled the man, pinning him down and punching him repeatedly until he was unconscious. A wave of relief washed over Joy. She asked her neighbor how he knew she was in danger. He explained that while going to his kitchen for a drink of water, he saw the man lurking around the building through his window. Sensing something was wrong, he decided to watch from a distance to see what would happen. The man was arrested. He had just been released after serving 30 years in prison for attempted murder and assault. The entire ordeal left her traumatized, and for months, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Joy continued to have nightmares about the man who had nearly taken her life that night. If it weren't for her neighbor, things could have ended very differently. Nightmare House on the Hillside. A new beginning. Lucy, a 7-year-old girl, moved with her family to an old suburban house. It was a historic home built in the mid-1800s. The house was 2 stories tall with a basement below. Down there was a locked door leading to water tanks used to heat the house. Only her mother and the landlord had the key. They warned her never to go near it. Lucy never understood why her room was always colder than the others, even though it was right above the basement. At night, she often heard strange creaking sounds, as if someone were walking on the floor, whispers, and distant footsteps pacing in the living room. The house was old and worn. She also frequently saw wasps emerging from the attic, swarming as if drawn to something. She wasn't the only one experiencing strange things. Her parents often heard footsteps late at night, pacing endlessly, but they dismissed it as nothing. One night, she woke up with an eerie feeling as if someone was in the room with her. Lucy turned over and saw a boy, his face hidden in the shadows. He wore old-fashioned clothes and stood near her desk. Lucy sat up in bed. The boy spoke, asking if she wanted to play with him. She refused, saying it was too late and she didn't want to get in trouble. His expression changed. He looked angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished into the cold darkness of the room. Lucy ran to tell her mother, but she reassured her that it was just a dream. Still, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. The next night, it happened again, but this time, it was worse. She woke up, unable to move. But this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She stood on Lucy's bed, her bare feet pressing into the blanket, long nails cracked and jagged. The woman bent down, her tangled hair falling over Lucy's face. She couldn't see her features, her wild hair obscured them. Then the woman stared at her, with hollow, blackened eyes. Her breath, ice cold, brushed against Lucy's skin. Lucy sprang up, threw open the door, and rushed to her sister's room. Her baby sister was still asleep in her crib. She had to make sure she was safe. She turned back to the door and saw the woman slowly stepping toward her. As she passed the window, a flash of lightning struck outside. For a brief second, the woman vanished. With each flicker of light, she reappeared closer and closer. Lucy woke up drenched in sweat, trying to piece together what had just happened. She ran to her mother and told her everything. Her mother's face turned pale as Lucy spoke, but in the end, she simply said it was just a nightmare. A lie one she had been telling since they moved in. Within days, the family moved out. Lucy's mother never gave them a reason. It wasn't until years later that Lucy finally dared to ask. The landlord eventually admitted what had happened in that house long ago. A widowed mother and her 3 children had once lived there. Their family had been happy together. During the Civil War, the mother had become a widow, and she and her 3 children remained in the house for a long time. After her husband died in battle, her mind shattered. In a fit of madness, she killed everyone else in the family right there in the living room, before dragging them down to the water storage room in the basement, the very place they had been warned never to go near. This explained everything Lucy had experienced: the misplaced toys, the shifting objects in her room. The boy Lucy had seen was one of her children, still trapped in the house, searching for a companion or perhaps revenge. And the woman, the one who stood on her bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horror she had committed. Lucy often wondered what would have happened if they had stayed in that house. Would they have become part of its story? Would the woman have done to them what she had done to her own children? She would never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she found herself thinking about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held. Fake stalkers. This happened a few years ago. Liz was home alone for the weekend while her parents attended a wedding, and she had invited a friend over, Maya. Maya, who lived just behind Liz's house, agreed to come over. Liz prepared snacks and tea, looking forward to a fun and relaxing day. About 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. However, it wasn't a normal ring. The person at the door was pressing it urgently, as if in a hurry. When she reached the door and asked,
Who's there?
a rushed voice responded.
Maya.
When Liz opened the door, she saw Maya standing there, looking disheveled and breathless. She rushed inside, visibly shaking with fear. Liz quickly led her inside and handed her a glass of water, then asked what had happened. Maya explained that while walking to Liz's house, she had noticed a man staring at her, smiling. Although she tried to ignore him and keep walking, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was following her. She turned around to check if the man was still there, and he was following her. Panicked, she ran to Liz's house, hoping to lose him. But by the time she arrived, the man had vanished. Liz reassured her friend that she was safe inside. They carried on with their plans for the day, but Maya remained uneasy, unable to shake off the fear from her encounter. After a while, both girls got hungry and decided to order a pizza. About half an hour later, the doorbell rang. Liz assumed it was the pizza delivery, so she got up to answer it. Liz walked toward the door.
Who is it?
She called, gripping the doorknob.
Pizza delivery, ma'am.
Just as she was about to turn the knob, a piercing scream from upstairs shattered the silence. Maya suddenly screamed from upstairs.
Liz, don't open the door.
Her voice filled with panic. Maya rushed down the stairs, yanking Liz away from the door with terrifying force. Liz barely had time to process what was happening before she was pulled back. Startled and confused, she demanded to know what was going on. With fear in her eyes, Maya began explaining everything. She said she had looked out the window and saw the same man who had followed her earlier. Now, he was standing at the door, waiting for them to open it. She believed he had been stalking them and was impersonating the pizza delivery man. Liz hesitated, wondering if Maya was overreacting. Maybe she was just paranoid after all. It was nearly impossible to see his face clearly in the darkness. Maya gripped her wrist tightly, her face pale as she saw Liz stepping toward the door.
Liz, don't. I saw him. It's him. It's the same man.
She took a step toward the door. The man spoke.
I saw you run. Don't leave. Open the door and take your pizza.
Liz froze. The man's words sent a chill down her spine. Suddenly, she remembered. Earlier that night, while watching Netflix, she had seen something move outside before they even ordered food. A shadow, a flicker, just for a second. But she had ignored it. Maybe it had been him. Snapping back to reality, Liz realized the door was now shaking violently. Maya dragged Liz upstairs into a bedroom and locked the door. The two girls huddled together, listening in terror. The man started pounding on the door, screaming for them to open it. The banging and his increasingly deranged voice sent chills through them. Overwhelmed with fear, Liz immediately called the police. All they could do was sit there, crying and praying for help. After what felt like forever, they heard police sirens. Finally, the man was caught. Liz and Maya were escorted out safely. The police informed them that they had found the body of a murdered pizza delivery driver. His uniform jacket had been stolen, used as a disguise. They had no idea what his true intentions were, but they were lucky. If Maya hadn't recognized him in time, they both might have been his next unfortunate victims. The intruder and courage. Nikki recalled when he was 9 years old. His parents adopted a dog, wanting him to grow up with a companion to help him learn boundaries and discipline, as well as have a playmate. The dog's name was Charlie, a golden retriever. One night, Nikki woke up past midnight and noticed that Charlie had jumped off the bed and was whining at the door. Nikki got up and went downstairs with Charlie. As he walked through the living room, he felt something pass by him that he couldn't even recognize. Nikki led Charlie out into the backyard and stood by the door, waiting for Charlie to quickly finish and come back inside. But when Charlie came back inside, he turned toward the garage door, walked over, and began sniffing intensely. Soon, Charlie's usual curiosity shifted to something else. He began whining, pacing and scratching at the door more aggressively, finally looking back at Nikki. Nikki hesitated, but Charlie wouldn't stop. Finally, Nikki opened the door and turned on the light. When the lights came on, there was a man wearing a black mask and dressed in all black, trying to break into Nikki's dad's Mercedes. Beneath him was a black bag full of stolen items. The man turned, startled by the light. Charlie immediately began barking, his deep, ferocious growls echoing through the garage. Nikki screamed for his parents, but within moments, the man reacted quickly, rushing over to grab him and cover his mouth. Charlie barked even louder, his desperation clear as he tried to protect Nikki. "Quiet," the man hissed, dragging Nikki toward the car. Charlie lunged, but the man kicked him out the door, sending him sprawling to the ground. His whimpers filled Nikki with heartbreak. Then the thief threw Nikki hard to the ground, leaving him weak and powerless. He leaned down, threatening him to stay quiet or else. After a moment, Charlie was on the other side of the door, barking again. Meanwhile, the man turned his attention back to the car, using a metal tool to try and pry the lock. Nikki sat frozen, trembling as Charlie's relentless barking continued. Moments later, the door burst open, and Nikki's parents rushed in with Charlie. Nikki's father's face contorted with anger as he took in the scene. "Let my son go," he shouted. The man turned around, grabbed Nikki, and put him in a chokehold. Nikki's father froze, and his face shifted from anger to immediate panic. It wasn't clear why until Nikki realized there was a knife pressed against his neck. The man demanded his parents step back, hand over the car keys, and let him drive away, or else he'd hurt the boy. Nikki's mother tightly held onto Charlie's collar, trying to restrain him as the dog growled and struggled against her grip. "Get the keys," Nikki's father said, his voice tense with fear. Nikki's mother turned toward the house, but her grip on Charlie slipped. The dog broke free and charged toward Nikki. The thief removed the knife from Nikki's neck, and the boy instinctively knew he would point it at Charlie. Acting on instinct, Nikki grabbed the knife and pulled it toward himself, the blade slicing through his fingers in agonizing pain. Charlie lunged forward. His jaws tore through the man's pants and clamped tightly onto his leg, causing him to scream in pain. Nikki's father immediately charged at the thief, pulling Nikki and Charlie away from him. Before the thief could react, his protective instincts took over, and he pinned the intruder to the ground, knocking him unconscious. It wasn't until Nikki's mother intervened that everything finally settled. Nikki could barely recall what happened next. All he knew was that the thief spent a long time in the hospital before being taken into custody. Nikki was also relieved that everyone, including Charlie, escaped without serious injury. Even though Charlie was older, he had proven his boundless love and loyalty to Nikki and the family. The night at the airport. Kevin was always a hardworking guy, juggling a daytime job and night shifts at the airport to earn extra money. Partly, it was convenient because he lived nearby, making the commute easy. It was Kevin's first night shift. The terminal was eerily quiet when he arrived around 1 a.m. The airport manager handed him a set of keys, saying he would return around 4 a.m.
"Do you have a flashlight?"
the manager asked. Kevin nodded, assuring him he did, and began his tasks, mopping the floors, inspecting restrooms, and ensuring no pipes were leaking. Everything was so quiet that he could hear the echo of his own footsteps. While wiping down the counters, he glanced out at the silent runway. It was a familiar sight, but tonight, something felt different. Then he heard a woman's laughter from somewhere far away. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the sound was too distinct to ignore.
Is anyone there?
Kevin called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. There was no reply. Suddenly, the sound changed. It was no longer laughter, but heavy footsteps coming from the restroom area. He assumed it might be a homeless person who had snuck in. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness. He grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the source of the noise. The restroom was at the end of the terminal, and his unease grew with each step. He shone his flashlight into the room, but the only thing he saw was a woman with long black hair, standing with her back to him. He couldn't see her face because she was facing away.
Excuse me, ma'am. You can't be here.
Something was off. She seemed to vanish. He stepped closer, noting strangely that none of the stall doors were closed. Kevin waited a few seconds in the dark with his flashlight before deciding to check for himself. When he reached the last stall, the hair on his neck stood on end. There was no woman. Alone in the restroom, he splashed water on his face, trying to shake off the sleepiness and clear his head. Kevin went out to find the power switch to turn the lights back on, but he froze. On the floor he had just cleaned, there were now dark, blood-like footprints. Sweat began dripping down his forehead as fear took hold. He decided to call his manager, but when he pulled out his phone, there was no signal. The footprints led him to the far end of the airport, near a narrow hallway that descended into the basement. Just before Kevin reached the basement door, he heard something, a heavy, labored breathing. Someone was on the other side. From the darkness, he saw an eye, wide open, with a tiny black pupil staring at him through a crack. Kevin panicked, collapsing to the floor. He had never felt this kind of fear in his life. Suddenly, the eye blinked, and Kevin realized he was entirely alone in the airport. He remembered locking the doors after the manager left, meaning there was no way anyone else could have entered. So, who was on the other side of the door? Suddenly, a bony hand with skeletal fingers appeared through the crack and beckoned to Kevin. The terrifying eyeballs stared at him. The woman's laughter echoed once more, and then the basement door burst open. Kevin wanted nothing more than to stand and run as a spine-chilling scream erupted, shattering every glass window around him. Kevin shielded his face from the flying shards and began shouting for help. Then, a chilling gust of wind swept over him. He opened his eyes to see a terrifying woman staring directly at him, so close that Kevin could feel her icy breath on his skin. Her face was gaunt, with blood dripping from her head as she stared into him. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but only distorted moans escaped. Then everything faded to black. Later, he awoke to someone calling his name. Kevin found himself lying on the floor, with the manager helping him up. Looking around, everything seemed untouched. There were no footprints or broken doors. After leaving, Kevin learned he had passed out near the site where a woman had been assaulted by a dangerous man. The culprit had disguised himself as a janitor to hide in the airport. Perhaps Kevin's decision not to follow the ghost into the basement had saved his life. Midnight flight. Due to his job, Lucas frequently traveled for business to meet clients. He was sitting alone at the airport, waiting for a late-night flight back to Sydney. The clock showed 1 a.m. The area where he was seated was almost deserted, except for a few scattered passengers. Lucas had his headphones on and was engrossed in his phone. The atmosphere felt strangely empty for such a usually busy airport. At that moment, a flight attendant, a woman in uniform with an eerie, unsettling smile, approached him and gently tapped him on the shoulder.
Sir, your flight is about to depart. I think you missed the announcement.
Lucas glanced around and realized he was the only one left in the waiting area. The elderly couple had already left, and there were no other passengers. His flight was scheduled for 1:30 a.m., but it was already 1:15 a.m. He quickly stood up and thanked her, surprised at how fast time had passed. Lucas got up and began following her. As they walked through the airport, he noticed something odd. She seemed to walk with an uneven gait. Then, he noticed a deep scar on her left leg, and her skin looked unusually pale. She led him onto the plane, and as he stepped inside, he was stunned to see that the entire plane was packed with passengers, none of whom he had noticed or seen in the waiting area. The atmosphere inside the plane was eerily silent, so much so that for a moment he thought no one was breathing. The passengers sat with their heads bowed, not talking, almost motionless. After boarding, she leaned close and whispered in his ear.
Please take your seat, sir.
If he had been alone, he might have screamed. The cold, chilling breath in her whisper made his ears feel frozen. Lucas went to his seat by the window. As he sat down, he noticed a thin man in formal attire seated next to him, but there was something off about his face. Lucas felt the plane was unusually cold, and soon, a foul stench began to permeate the air around him. Lucas fastened his seatbelt and waited for the plane to take off, but none of the other passengers moved or changed their behavior. They all remained silent and expressionless. He told the man next to him.
It's so cold in here.
The man didn't reply. He just sat there with his head bowed. Lucas thought maybe he was asleep or didn't want to talk. Then all the lights began flickering. Suddenly, the emergency alarm blared, and the plane started shaking violently. Lightning flashed across the sky outside. A violent jolt caused luggage to fall from the overhead compartments. He screamed, but the man next to him and everyone else showed no signs of panic. They all sat like statues, seemingly indifferent to what was happening. In a panic, Lucas tried to unbuckle his seatbelt, but it was stuck. Desperate, he shouted for help. Then, he turned to the man next to him, saying,
Excuse me, please wake up. This plane is going to crash. Please, we need to do something, or we're all going to die.
As Lucas struggled, the man next to him slowly looked up. His face was horrifying, with one side severely burned and scarred. He smiled, a chilling, terrifying grin, and said,
They're all dead.
The other passengers now revealed grotesque faces. A spine-chilling, sinister laughter erupted from all of them. They began laughing in unison, a shrill, terrifying sound. Please let me off, he begged. At that moment, his seatbelt came undone, and he ran toward the exit to escape. But the flight attendant suddenly appeared, blocking his path. Her face was now unrecognizable, her body covered in wounds, smeared with blood, and she had a wide, menacing grin. He shoved the flight attendant aside and ran toward the cockpit, hoping to find the pilots. When he opened the door, he was met with a horrifying sight. Both pilots were gone, and everything inside was engulfed in flames. His vision began to blur. His head throbbed, and the faint sound of devilish laughter echoed in his ears.
Sir, are you okay?
The voice startled Lucas awake. It was a security guard at the airport, leaning down to check on him. He slowly sat up, his body trembling, and looked around. He was no longer on the plane. Instead, Lucas was lying next to the charred wreckage of what looked like an old airplane. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and something worse. The guard told him that this area was restricted.
That plane had been struck by lightning a week ago, and everyone on board, including the flight attendants and pilots, had perished.
Shocked, Lucas stammered that he had been on that plane. He looked at the plane, horrified by what he had just experienced. He knew he had narrowly escaped the dark fate that had befallen the passengers of that ill-fated flight.
The Window Stalker.
It all started that day, when I was just a child, too young to fully comprehend the horror that was about to unfold. Our home was always cozy, with large windows in the living room that overlooked the beautiful garden outside. I was sitting on the couch with my back to the window, fully immersed in my favorite TV show. My mother was in the kitchen, doing her usual chores, but then something caught my attention. In the reflection of the TV screen, I saw the silhouette of a man. I could see him through the glass, standing motionless in the garden behind me. I thought it was probably my dad, so I didn't turn around. I called out, horror story about a truck driver. As soon as I said that, I saw my mom freeze and then rush into the living room. When my mom saw the figure standing outside the window, her face went blank. I had never seen her look so terrified. I turned around. There he was, a stranger, a scruffy man with wild eyes, just standing there staring at us with a sick, twisted grin. He didn't seem to care that he had been spotted. He just smiled wider, almost enjoying the fear he was causing in my mother and me. Without hesitation, my mom yelled, threatening to call the police if he came closer, but I could sense her fear. And then he said something that still chills me to this day. He growled through the glass with a menacing voice. "If you touch that phone, I'll break this window, and neither of you will be safe." My mom hesitated, torn between calling for help and protecting me, unsure of what to do next. His eyes flared with anger as he fumbled with something inside his coat. And then, in the blink of an eye, he lunged toward the back door. I heard him pounding on it, frantically rattling the doorknob. Thank God it was locked. His frustration turned into rage. He screamed, demanding to be let in, threatening that if he got inside, he wouldn't spare us. I was too young to fully grasp the danger we were in. My mom grabbed me, pulling me off the couch, and we ran upstairs. We didn't stop until we reached the top floor, and that's when I saw my uncle, my mom's younger brother. My uncle was standing in the hallway, headphones on, completely unaware of the chaos downstairs. He was a big, muscular man, the kind you wouldn't want to mess with. He used to compete in boxing matches and had won several trophies. My uncle, confused, asked, "What's going on?" as my mom frantically explained. And just as she finished, we heard the man's voice again, coming from downstairs. His voice echoed through the house, saying, "The boogeyman is coming to get you." Those words were etched into my memory. My uncle heard him and told us to lock ourselves in the bathroom and call the police. My mom pulled me into the bathroom, locked the door as instructed, and called 911. I could hear the man downstairs, his voice growing more erratic. Then, the sound of glass shattering echoed throughout the house. My mom and I held our breath, frozen in fear, waiting for what felt like an eternity for something to happen. We waited and prayed that it was over. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. We braced ourselves, fearing the worst. My uncle slowly stepped out of his hiding spot, waiting for the perfect moment to tackle the man, relying on his sharp reflexes as a seasoned boxer. He didn't hold back and swiftly disarmed the man. My uncle saved us. The door swung open, and the police arrived just in time, securing the situation. They arrested the man and informed us that he was a dangerous criminal they had been hunting for some time. That day changed everything. My mom never felt comfortable being alone again and always looked over her shoulder at the windows. If it hadn't been for my uncle, I don't know what would have happened. I still shudder when I think about it. Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most windows were dark. Rena was standing outside, staring up at the second floor. Her floor. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet, until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and taking out the trash usually only took a few minutes. But tonight, she felt as though someone was watching her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hallway, he was there. Arthur was standing by his door, looking as though he had been waiting for her. He always found excuses to talk and stand uncomfortably close to Rena. She lowered her head, quickly murmured a greeting, and walked toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. Goosebumps rose on Rena's skin. Something felt different tonight, making her more uneasy than before. Rena entered her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to lie in bed and watch TV. It was late, and she was tired, but she wasn't ready to sleep yet. As she walked past the broom closet, she heard a faint sound, a soft rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet door handle. She hesitated. Then she pulled the door open. Arthur was in there, inside her storage closet. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He was just there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She gasped, stumbling backward, unable to believe what she was seeing. She ran into her bedroom, slamming the door shut. But she didn't have time to lock it. The door burst open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild and unhinged. She dashed toward the bathroom, the only place left to hide. She slammed the door shut just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena's back pressed against the cold bathroom wall. Her breaths came in quick gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was the only thing separating her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks. His sickening grin etched deeply into her mind. Thankfully, she had her phone. She clutched it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, strangled by the fear gripping her. Arthur pounded on the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it couldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. She didn't know if he had left. Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience had run out. His hand hovered over the doorknob. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to escape. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gleaming knife. His fingers tightened around the handle. Nightmare neighbor. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed away, nearly pressing herself against the wall. She screamed at him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a bruising grip. Rena struggled to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it against the wall. Her phone slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor. Arthur's face was only inches from hers as he hissed threats, blaming her for always ignoring him when they crossed paths in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, squeezing tighter. His knife swiped through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain tore through her skin, leaving her injured and bleeding. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder as the police rushed toward the apartment building. The flashing lights reflected on the window, like a beacon of hope in the stifling darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her neck. Her free hand flailed, fumbling along the counter by the sink and the shelves, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it against Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered backward, momentarily dazed. Arthur stumbled, and the knife slipped from his grip, falling to the floor. Rena didn't wait. She bolted for the door, clutching her bleeding arm. She fled the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Blood streamed down his face from where the glass bottle had struck him. Enraged, he grabbed the knife from the floor and charged toward her. The police stormed the apartment complex. They knew they had to act fast. Rena reached the living room, but her legs gave out, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence closing in, the knife still in his hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight in them gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, struggling to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled.
There's nowhere left to run, girl.
Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police stormed into the apartment, cutting through the tension. Arthur stubbornly held on to her, refusing to let her go. Seizing the opportunity, Rena stomped on his foot, making him cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm, but the nightmare was over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of the car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. Trained to hell. Rye, he had once been a professional thief. No matter where he was, he could carry out his actions smoothly. That day, the location was the subway, and it was also where he would pay a heavy price for his sins. While fleeing from pursuit, Rye boarded a subway train that looked quite old, carrying the scent of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly metallic, almost like the smell of blood. The subway car was nearly empty, except for a few scattered passengers in various cars. Most of them seemed lost in their own worlds. One was dozing off, another absorbed in their phone. But then, at the far end of the car, there was an older man who looked quite terrifying. He wore a long, dark coat, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes were cold and piercing, chillingly sharp. Rye tried to shake off the discomfort, shifting in his seat, looking elsewhere. But the feeling of always being watched made him very alert. The subway suddenly jolted, the lights flickering more violently before dimming to a weak, pale yellow. The train began to slow down, the sound of the brakes screeching like a high-pitched wail echoing through the thief's skull. He glanced around, noticing that the other passengers had disappeared, leaving only him and the mysterious man at the end of the car. He tried to stand up, move toward the exit, but his legs were stiff. The man in the dark coat began to stand up, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the thief. The subway train came to a complete stop. The doors remained closed. The thief was trapped. The man approached the thief, raising one hand with fingers unusually long and thin, and waved it slowly in front of the thief's face. The thief's eyes glazed over, his mind succumbing to the invisible power of hypnosis. His body went limp, collapsing into the seat as he was pulled into a vision, deeper and deeper, until the subway car completely vanished. Rye found himself standing in a nightmarish version of a subway station. The walls were cracked and oozing a thick black substance, the lights flickering. The tracks were covered in a dense, glowing red fog that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The thief staggered forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked around, trying to find a way out. But the exits were blocked, sealed shut by heavy iron gates covered in chains and padlocks that had mysteriously appeared. A moment later, he suddenly saw a reflection in the glass, a reflection of himself, but with his coat tattered and scorched, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes. His lips twisted into a grotesque, terrifying smile. Scenes of his past crimes played out before him, distorted and twisted into horrific images of suffering and despair. In one scene, he watched himself pickpocketing a man on the subway, but this time, the man turned to him, his face melting away to reveal a skull with eyes burning with fire. The skeletal figure grabbed the thief's wrist, pulling him into the darkness where the sound of screams echoed. Next, another vision unfolded. Rai broke into an apartment, and suddenly, the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell into a pit filled with writhing hands, clawing at his flesh as they dragged him down, as if pulling him into hell. The images kept coming, each more horrifying than the last. Each vision was a punishment for the sins he had committed. He saw himself as one of the damned, trapped forever on this hellish train, riding the tracks of torment for all eternity. Inside the train, the thief was surrounded by the ghosts of his past victims. Their eyes burned with the fire of hatred. In his own eyes, the furnace roared with life, the flames growing hotter until they consumed everything. The thief was left in total darkness. The thief snapped back to reality, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. He was back in the subway car. The man in the dark coat was gone, leaving only the sound of the train clattering on the tracks. Shaking, the thief staggered to his feet and exited the train. As he stepped onto the platform, he glanced back at the subway car. The train pulled away, the sound of its departure echoing through the empty station. The thief stood alone, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Now he knew that there was no escaping the consequences, the punishment for his actions. Since that day, he has lived in darkness, plagued by agonizing headaches that feel like torture. He must live in fear, haunted by what he had seen and experienced. Perhaps this is just one of the punishments he has to endure. The final warnings. Alan and his wife, Cheryl, had lived in that house for many years. It was his childhood home, a place filled with memories. But after his mother passed away, something changed. The walls whispered, doors opened on their own, and an unnatural chill settled in even during the summer. Alan and Cheryl weren't the only ones who noticed. Their daughter would wake up screaming, saying that a woman stood at the foot of her bed, humming a strange lullaby. He convinced himself that it was her, that she had stayed behind to watch over them. But if that were true, why did the house feel so wrong? As if it was warning them of something. Then, things got worse. Sometimes, objects flew off the shelves, smashing against the walls, turning the house into something dangerous. They couldn't take it anymore. They made the difficult decision to sell the house. They sold it to a young woman named Reilly. She loved its antique charm and was excited to make it her own. Cheryl handed over the keys, relieved to leave the past behind. But perhaps the house wasn't ready to let them go. The first few nights were peaceful. Then, the strange things began. Reilly would hear footsteps at night, even when she was certain she was alone. Doors she had locked would swing open at midnight, leaving her sleepless for days. The longer she stayed, the stronger the feeling of being watched grew. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if something unseen was hovering over her shoulder. And then, the nightmares began. A woman stood in the darkness of her room, her face obscured, lips moving as if whispering something. A lullaby. Then she screamed, "Bring them back." Reilly woke up gasping, cold sweat dripping down her skin. She knew she couldn't handle this alone. Desperate for answers, Reilly reached out to Alan and Cheryl, begging them to come back and help her. They didn't want to return, but deep down they knew this wasn't over. That night, they drove back. The three of them gathered, and Alan and Cheryl sat before an old Ouija board in the living room, an ancient tool used to communicate with the dead. "Who are you?" The board slowly revealed the letters, Mother. Alan felt a wave of relief. "Mom, it's me, Alan. Why are you still here?" The board spelled out promise. Alan remembered a conversation before his mother passed away. She had been terrified of something. She had once told him, "If I die here, don't let the house be abandoned. If no one lives here, it will wake up." Really realized that the house had never been haunted by Alan's mother. She had been keeping something else trapped, preventing it from escaping, but they still didn't know what she had been protecting them from. Really recalled seeing a strange basement in the house. She went there and discovered a hidden passage, locked away for decades. The moment they opened the basement, chaos erupted. Screams echoed from the walls. Furniture flew across the room. The Ouija board shattered on the floor. A loud explosion shook the room. Lights flickered violently. The walls groaned as if they were about to collapse. Then, a voice rang out not from the board, but from the darkness, his mother's voice, begging them to seal the passage. The entity grabbed Alan, trying to drag him into the darkness. Riley and Cheryl, desperate, saw a book fly toward them from nowhere. Alan's mother screamed, telling them to recite the prayer to push the entity back. Alan rushed forward, and they began sealing it shut. But then his mother told them they had to burn it. Alan hesitated. Burning. It meant destroying everything. Every memory of his mother in this house. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, telling him to let it go. She had spent decades protecting him from this thing. And so, he made his choice. He set it on fire. As the flames spread, Alan's mother appeared one last time.
"Thank you, my son."
For the first time in years, she looked at peace. Then she vanished. The three of them barely escaped as the house collapsed behind them. After that, Alan decided not to rebuild the house. Years passed, and the once beautiful home rotted away, sealed forever. Strange man in the cemetery. This summer, my family decided to go camping in a suburban village, a place where every corner seemed to hold a mysterious story. The locals were always whispering, especially about the nearby forest. But what intrigued me the most was the cemetery within the forest. No one had ever gone there after dark. We were not allowed to go there either. My cousin had the idea to play hide and seek at night. He liked to break boundaries, challenging all of us to venture into the forbidden forest. I went with my younger sister, who was only 10 at the time, and my cousin. He confidently decided to help us hide. I should have known it was a bad idea the moment he mentioned the cemetery. We crept through the forest, the leaves crunching underfoot. The closer we got to the cemetery, the colder the air became. Even the stray dogs that had been barking earlier were now completely silent. A sense of fear and unease flooded over me. My little sister held my hand tightly. But then, in the eerie silence, a sound pierced the air, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the unmistakable sound of digging. Out of the darkness, we saw him, a disheveled old man in filthy clothes, hunched over a grave. He was digging with his bare hands, muttering something incomprehensible. My eyes followed his hand. I saw something pale, like a stiff hand, sticking out of the freshly dug earth. None of us dared to move for a moment. My cousin was the first to act. He slowly pulled us back, whispering that we had to leave, that we needed to move silently. The man bent down again, this time pulling away more earth, revealing more of an arm, a foot, a body. Then he dragged out several small plastic bags and laid them on the ground. My sister trembled, and we were slowly sneaking away. Then I accidentally stepped on a branch. My heart skipped a beat, knowing that sound might give us away. He slowly raised his head, turned to us, and said,
"You shouldn't be here."
Then he stared at us and gave a slow, creepy smile, as if he had lost his mind. The man laughed maniacally, wiping his dirty hands on his pants. Then he took a step forward, his bare feet dragging across the ground.
"You kids want to know what's down here?"
Before I could react, my cousin scooped up my sister, pulling her into his arms. The man's voice taunted us, as if daring us.
"See what they're hiding in the ground."
I stumbled, frozen, My cousin yanked on my arm, snapping me back to reality. He yelled, "Run!" and we bolted away from the cemetery. I ran as if my life depended on it. I could hear him behind us, his feet scraping on the gravel, his wheezing breath growing closer. I didn't dare stop. My cousin pulled us forward, his grip tight, until we reached the cemetery gate. We burst through the gate. For some reason, the man had stopped. He was no longer chasing us. He didn't follow, just stood there, watching. Then, as if he had never been there, he turned around and disappeared into the darkness of the cemetery. We returned to the campsite. No one said a word or mentioned what had happened. The next day, we found out that the old man had been arrested by the police. He was a deranged criminal who had been desecrating graves to smuggle drugs across the border. That night, we felt truly lucky. I still wonder what would have happened if he had been younger, stronger, faster. We never went near that forest again and reminded ourselves never to ignore warnings and restrictions again. The delivery trip was trapped. Leo, a delivery driver working for Amazon, found himself trapped in an unimaginable situation. After a routine delivery took a dark turn, he was making his final delivery of the shift during a heavy thunderstorm. The rain made driving difficult, and he was unfamiliar with the area. The storm calmed slightly after 15 minutes of waiting. Leo glanced at the package on the passenger seat.
Might as well get this over with,
he sighed. After another 20 minutes of driving, his final destination appeared a strange 2-story wooden house, standing alone in a desolate area. Leo parked, grabbed the package, and walked toward the house. He rang the doorbell and waited for the homeowner to respond. The house was completely dark, which made him uneasy. It would be unfortunate if no one was home. He waited, but there was no answer. He rang the doorbell again. Still nothing. Just as Leo turned to leave, he suddenly heard faint footsteps approaching the door. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing a thin man with dark circles under his eyes. He just stood there, staring at Leo, without saying a word.
"Sorry for the delay. Here's your package,"
Leo said, handing it to the man. The man took the package and gave a strange smile. As Leo turned to leave, the man spoke.
Would you like to join us for a birthday party?
It was an odd request, so Leo politely declined, saying,
"Oh no, thanks. I have a long drive home, and it's already late."
The man began talking about how no one had shown up for his daughter's birthday, and how nice it would be if Leo could stay for a bit. Feeling guilty about the late delivery, and sorry for the child, Leo decided to stay for a little while. As Leo stepped inside, he noticed there was no electricity, only the faint glow of candles, creating an eerie atmosphere. He quietly followed the man, the house so silent that he could hear their footsteps on the wooden floor. They stopped in front of a door and entered a large room, but everything inside struck Leo as deeply unsettling. A large dining table sat in the center of the room, with several covered plates resting on it. Candles flickered, but there were no birthday decorations. This did not feel like a celebration at all. As Leo was glancing around, the man suddenly appeared behind him, shouting,
Happy birthday!
He then told Leo to sit down while he went to fetch his daughter. Leo reluctantly sat down, glancing around, but something in his mind kept telling him that he shouldn't be here. Yet, he couldn't leave just yet, so he decided to stay until they cut the birthday cake. 5 minutes passed, but the man never returned. Just as Leo decided to get up and look for him, he heard a strange whimpering sound coming from behind a locked door in the room. Leo slowly approached the door, straining to listen. Someone was whimpering in pain, but the voice was faint, as if they were on the brink of death. He tried turning the doorknob, but it was locked. Bending down, he peeked through the keyhole. What he saw made him freeze in shock. A man was tied to a chair, his body covered in wounds, barely clinging to life. His skin was marked with deep cuts. Leo staggered backward. He turned to run but froze as he heard a voice behind him.
Why the rush, buddy?
In the next instant, a sharp pain struck his head, and his vision blurred. Leo blacked out, only to wake up to a hauntingly cheerful rendition of Happy Birthday playing in the background. His head throbbed as he realized he was tied to a chair at the dining table. Sitting across from him was the same man from before. The man stood nearby, holding a covered plate in his hands, grinning.
Welcome to dinner.
Then he moved from plate to plate, lifting the lids. What lay beneath was unsettling chunks of raw meat, grotesque and unrecognizable. Leo realized it had all been a lie. There was no daughter. This man was a psychopath, and this was how he hunted his victims. Leo screamed, begging for his life, but the man only chuckled coldly. The man picked up a saw from the floor and charged at Leo. Just as he raised it above his head, a loud explosion rang out. The man collapsed onto the floor as police gunfire struck him. Leo couldn't remember how they got him out of the house. Perhaps he had blacked out again. The horrifying truth came to light. The man was a deranged serial killer. The tied-up man was actually a detective who had uncovered the killer's identity and alerted authorities before he was captured. Leo suffered injuries, but he and the man who had tried to save him had both survived. The horror lingered in Leo's mind, especially the killer's final chilling words to the police. "I just have a different taste in food." His eerie smile was the last thing Leo wanted to remember. The mysterious harmony from the ancient piano. Nee, a young woman in her early 20s, stepped into a small, dimly lit antique shop in a quiet neighborhood. The shop was cluttered with antiques, old books, worn furniture, dusty frames, and a few musical instruments scattered around. The air reeked of aged wood and forgotten memories. Nee walked past the counter where the shopkeeper stood. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he had been waiting. His face was gaunt, his skin pale. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was strange.
You found the piano. It's calling you. It will begin soon.
The word sent a chill down her spine, since she hadn't mentioned the piano. The atmosphere grew odd. She decided to look around briefly and leave quickly. Then, Nee's gaze landed on a piano, old and tucked away in the corner of the shop. Despite its age, its darkened wood seemed to exude a mysterious allure. She brushed her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument's delicate beauty starkly contrasted its eerie presence, making it irresistible. She approached the counter to face the man again. This time, she noticed his hands were marked with faint, dark scars, as if burned or clawed repeatedly, the lines deep and jagged. She decided to take the piano and leave. The door chimed behind her, and she turned to see the shopkeeper standing at the window, staring at her unblinkingly as she walked away. From the moment she placed it in her room, strange things began to happen. Nee began to play the piano softly, trying to familiarize herself with its peculiar presence. The keys, though old, worked, but felt strange beneath her fingers. Suddenly, Nee stopped playing. The music lingered in the air for a moment before dissolving into faint whispers. She stood, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. One night, after a restless sleep, she returned to the piano. Nye found a yellowed sheet of music tucked among the piano strings. Curious yet uneasy, she played it, only to discover the notes resonated in an inexplicable way. It felt as though the notes were alive, playing themselves before her fingers touched the keys. Unintentionally, Nee had begun to unlock the tragic history of the piano's previous owner. She continued to play, unable to understand why she couldn't stop. She heard a faint voice whispering in her ear, speaking an ancient language. The words seemed to echo in her mind, filling her thoughts. She stood up abruptly, thinking she was probably too tired, and decided to head to her room and sleep. Nee drifted into slumber after a tense day. She was no longer in her room, but found herself in a grand concert hall. The room was empty, except for a grand piano at its center, and dim light from antique chandeliers that looked decades old. As Nee approached the piano, she saw a tall, gaunt man seated at the keys. He wore an old black suit, but his sunken eyes and pale skin made him look like a wax statue. Nee called out,
Who's there?
The man slowly turned around. His gaze pierced through Nee, and his voice echoed like a distant whisper.
I've waited a long time.
Nee tried to step back, but it felt like her feet were pinned to the floor. The man glided closer, not moving his legs, as if floating on air. Then the man pointed toward an old table nearby. On it lay a dusty sheet of music titled Sonata of Eternity.
There's not much time left. Only this melody can save us, or drown us both.
Before Nee could respond, the space around her twisted into a black vortex, engulfing her. She woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, clutching a corner of her blanket. Everything around her was silent. The dream not only left a haunting impression, but also led Nee to crucial details in reality. Perhaps she had unwittingly opened a door, allowing the spirits and tragic memories of the composer to resurface. She could still recall the image of the man struggling amidst the shadows, his eyes filled with despair, as if begging her to uncover the truth. She stopped playing the piano. For days, she couldn't bring herself to touch the instrument. Night after night, Nee heard whispers growing louder and more persistent, making everything feel increasingly unbearable.
Help me. Free me from the curse.
These words seemed to come from the trapped soul of the composer, still bound to the piano through his music. Waking in despair, Nee approached the piano, slowly sitting down. She noticed a small, faint mirror appearing behind the instrument. Nee cautiously wiped the dust from the mirror. Beneath the grime, the figure of a man slowly emerged. The gaunt man, his deep, dark eyes locked onto hers. He said nothing, but his gaze was intense, almost pleading, as if trying to convey something. After staring into the mirror, Nee saw words gradually appear on the glass. The crooked writing seemed as though someone was etching it from the other side. You have only one chance. Then his bony, emaciated hand reached out from the mirror, grasping toward her, begging for salvation. Understand the final rhythm before you play.
Please, help me. Save me.
A weight pressed against her chest before everything returned to normal. Nee realized she had to complete the sonata. The only way to break the curse was to finish the music she had started. She was plunged into despair and fear as she realized the price of freeing him. If she didn't play the final sonata, the curse would claim her as well. As Nee studied the sheet music, every note seemed distorted, warning her. It revealed the words, When the piano begins to play, you must finish the music before the light in the mirror fades. If not, the door will close forever. Nee swallowed hard, feeling the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out. It could happen at any moment. In her darkest hour, Nee sat before the piano, determined to break the curse. The clock struck midnight. The room was ice cold, and the music filled the air like an oppressive weight. Nee's fingers trembled as she began to play the sonata, the final piece in the composer's symphony of sorrow. But as she neared the final notes, Nee realized the sheet music was incomplete. A note had been erased, forcing her to rely on her intuition to finish the piece. She couldn't stop now. Then the mirror behind the piano shattered. Startled, she paused for half a second but couldn't stop. The gaunt figure of the man seemed to crack with the mirror, his eyes filled with despair.
Save me. Be careful. If you fail, you will take my place,
he cried out, his voice laced with agony. Ni played the final note, placing all her faith in her intuition. In the last moment of the sonata, the piano emitted a piercing sound. A brilliant light burst from the mirror, and she felt the entire room being drawn into the vortex. The man's figure vanished, and the room suddenly fell silent. In the ensuing silence, the figure in the mirror was gone, leaving behind a whispered,
"Thank you."
The room felt lighter, as if both their burdens had been lifted. When the light faded, Ni found herself sitting in her quiet room, all the strings of her instrument broken, and the mirror shattered. Exhausted, Ni collapsed on the piano. Perhaps everything was truly over, and fortunately, she had completed it. But deep down, Ni didn't know if she would ever truly escape the haunting melodies that had once drowned her. The deadly farewell. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I walked through the sterile hallway of the hospital. I had worked here for years, the smell of antiseptic and the beeping of monitors ingrained in my senses. But lately, something felt different, something that always sent a chill down my spine. My patients came in all ages, but there was one little girl named Tira, perhaps the youngest patient in the hospital. Tira was a sweet child. She often wandered the halls and talked to other patients, though she was mostly alone. One night, while working a night shift, I was doing my rounds as usual. In the empty, long corridor, I heard two people talking softly. It was late, and all patients were supposed to be asleep. I followed the sound, which was coming from room 203. As I carefully opened the door to check, I saw her. Tira was standing near the patient's bed, smiling at me mysteriously and greeting me. But my sudden appearance didn't startle her at all. I reminded her that it was past bedtime and asked what she was doing there. She replied,
Nothing. I just came to say goodbye to George.
George was the patient in room 203. He had recently undergone major surgery. Though Tira seemed calm to me, I noticed George's face. He looked terrified and extremely pale. When I turned to remind her and take Tira back to her room, she had vanished as quickly as if she'd never been there. The next day, I went home around 4 a.m. after my night shift ended. It was my day off, so I slept the entire day. When I returned to work and walked past room 203, I thought about checking on George. But when I opened the door, I found a different patient. And I was informed that George had passed away the previous day. I stood frozen in the hallway, suddenly remembering when I asked Tira what she was doing in George's room. She said she came to say goodbye. But why goodbye? Shouldn't it have been good night? Something was very strange. Every time I encountered little Tira, I would find her wandering the empty hallways at night, talking to someone or entering a room. At first, I was skeptical, but I noticed that her presence seemed to coincide with the moments just before a patient passed away. Could she possess the strange ability to know when someone was about to die? Then I searched the hospital records. Tira wasn't listed anywhere. There was no information about her being admitted, and no legal guardianship papers on file. I was stunned. I gradually became obsessed with Tira's story and started investigating her background. My suspicions grew when I learned from a nurse that Tira had died in the hospital just a few months ago after falling down the stairs. However, the nurse insisted the incident was ruled an accident, and the hospital never made it public. My mind reeled. How could Tira still be here if she was dead? I started piecing things together, and a chilling thought struck me. Perhaps Tira's spirit was still lingering here. One day, when I dozed off at my desk, I saw her. She was sitting, crying in my dream. I slowly approached Tira. Tira turned to face me, her pale face and empty eyes brimming with a profound sadness. She said,
I've been waiting for you, Dr. Cooper. You're the only one who can help me.
I stood frozen, the air thick with fear, or perhaps confusion. I asked Tira,
Help you? Tell me how.
Tira's ghost stepped closer, her small hand reaching toward me. She whispered painfully.
The experiment. The experiment killed me.
I jolted awake at my desk, drenched in sweat from what I had seen. It was too real, like a cry for help. I knew I needed to act. I dug through old records, my hands trembling. I found it, just a copy, a part of a plan I'd never seen before. It all seemed to point to a dark secret. The deeper I delved into Tira's past, the more I realized her death was no accident. In reality, it was the result of an illegal medical experiment involving an unapproved drug to test the limits of human pain endurance and survival. Tira was selected as a test subject due to the influence of her adoptive father, a man working at the hospital as part of an underground network of unethical experiments. The drug used on Tira was untested and had horrifying side effects. Tira's death was the culmination of a cover-up to protect the hospital's reputation. One night, while working the night shift at the hospital, I heard strange noises, like a child crying, coming from the abandoned wing of the hospital. The sounds led me down a hallway that hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded as I pushed open a door, revealing a forgotten room. Tira stood there, her figure faint in the dim light, her eyes filled with sadness and pain. She told me that she couldn't leave, and that she had been trapped in the hospital ever since her death. Her spirit was tethered to the hospital, bound to the hallways, unable to move on until the truth about her death was revealed. Tira had guided other souls to the afterlife, but she herself was trapped here. When I made my final efforts to reveal the truth, the hospital management and the girl's adoptive father tried to discredit me, even going to great lengths to silence me by threatening my career. The hallways were empty, the hospital eerily silent. I walked through them, knowing they were trying to stop me. But I didn't falter, and I was determined to report everything to the authorities, ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. As the authorities investigated, I stood in a patient's room, moonlight streaming through the window. I saw the silhouette of a little girl standing behind me. It was Tira, appearing now in a more peaceful form. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. She thanked me, her voice gentle, as her figure began to fade away. Tira's departure finally brought clarity. The hospital faced public outrage, and the administration was forced to shut down. Her adoptive father was arrested for his involvement in the illegal experiments, and justice was served. Although Tira's ghost was gone, the darkness of the hospital remained, reminding me that the line between life and death, between justice and illegality, is often much thinner than we imagine. Invisible ownership. Lena grew up in a strict family that didn't believe in ghosts, but was absolutely certain about demons. But her mother was different. She was indifferent to faith and struggled with mental health issues. One night, Lena had a terrifyingly vivid nightmare that she remembers in detail to this day. Lena was lying in bed when her mother burst into her room, screaming in rage. She grabbed Lena's wrist and shook her violently. Lena woke up drenched in sweat, her body stiff with fear. But before she could shake off the nightmare, it happened again, except this time, she wasn't asleep. The door swung open, and there she was, just like in Lena's nightmare. The same furious expression, the same inexplicable anger, the same words. It was as if the dream had been a prophecy. Lena barely managed to push her away, screaming for her to stop. And then, just as suddenly as she had entered, her mother walked away. The next morning, when Lena confronted her, her mother remembered nothing. She looked confused, even slightly hurt. Lena was too shocked and told herself it was just a coincidence, but deep down, she wondered if it was something much worse. A few weeks later, Lena heard her mother screaming from the backyard. It was a strange sound, not a scream of panic or even distress, but of excitement. She rushed outside and froze at what she saw. Her mother stood in the yard, grinning, holding a snake in her bare hands. But the worst part? She had been terrified of snakes her whole life. She couldn't even look at them on TV without recoiling. Yet, there she was, clutching the snake like it was a toy.
Come here, take it.
Mom, what the hell is going on?
But her mother's eyes didn't seem to register her words. She just smiled and tilted her head in an eerie way. Lena turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind her. Peeking through the window, she saw her mother still standing there, holding the snake like an offering, before finally placing it down and walking inside as if nothing had happened. That winter, her church hosted an overnight retreat, a chance for Lena to escape her chaotic home life. She felt relieved to go. Her mother dropped her off, completely lucid, even kissing her forehead before driving away. Around 4:30 a.m., as everyone lay deep in sleep, a loud knocking echoed through the chapel. Everyone sat up, glancing at each other. The knocking moved around the building in an unimaginable way, sometimes seeming to come from multiple directions at once, rhythmic and eerie. No one knew where it was coming from. The pastor, the only one with the key, was asleep in his office and hadn't heard anything. Lena ran to wake him up. As soon as he stepped into the chapel, the knocking stopped. He opened the front door and actually staggered back in fear. Standing there, barefoot in the freezing cold, clothes disheveled, hair drenched in sweat, it was Lena's mother. Her lips moved, but Lena couldn't hear what she was saying. She didn't acknowledge the pastor. Her eyes locked onto Lena immediately. A slow, unsettling smile spread across her face as she stepped toward her. The pastor grabbed her wrist.
Stay here.
But Lena felt utterly powerless, as if she had no choice but to go with her mother. She climbed into the car, afraid that her mother would do something, but she didn't. The drive home was silent. She said nothing, no explanation, no response when Lena asked why she had come. When they reached home, she stopped at the door and simply stared at Lena, standing silently as Lena walked into her room. Lena shut the door, locked it, and lay awake for hours, listening. But her mother's behavior only grew stranger. The next morning, her mother acted completely normal standing in the kitchen, happily making breakfast, as if the strange events of the night before had never happened. No one else at the church remembered it. Or worse, they refused to talk about it. That was how people treated her mother back then. Now, her mother was gone, but Lena would never forget. The experience lingered, and the uncertainty of what she had witnessed haunted her long after. For better or worse, she no longer knew if she believed in demons or the supernatural, but Lena couldn't explain what had happened. Ghost in the gym. A violent storm raged outside, the rain pattering against the windows of the gym. Today, Nana arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the upcoming exam, hurrying toward the gym. Her gym teacher greeted each student outside the girls' locker room, as usual. Nana entered the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly due to the storm. She walked to her locker and took out her workout clothes. As she began preparing her things, a faint shadow caught her eye, gliding along the other side of the lockers. She paused, glancing around. Curiosity overcame her, and she called out, "Is anyone there?" Nana walked toward the source of the noise, which was at the end of the locker room, where a row of shower stalls stood, the last stall covered by a thick, dark curtain. Nana approached, the lights beginning to flicker erratically. Not knowing where she found the courage, she reached out and pulled back the closed curtain, revealing only an empty shower stall. She was about to turn away when she sensed someone passing right behind her. She froze for a moment, Then a sound like soft sobbing echoed back, sending chills down her spine. The temperature suddenly dropped, a chill enveloping her. At that moment, the voices of other girls echoed in from the hallway. Nana temporarily felt relieved as she stepped out of the shower area and saw a group of students walking by. She asked if they heard someone crying, but the girls exchanged puzzled glances and shook their heads. She returned to the gym class, where everyone was gathered. Suddenly, a terrified scream echoed throughout the gym. A fellow student named Lee ran in, her face pale and filled with fear. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The gym class fell silent as everyone stared in horror, confused and frightened. As the teacher pressed Lee to explain, she trembled, describing a horrifying scene she told of a baby, covered in blood, appearing in the bathroom and standing there crying. After class, Nana decided to stay behind for extra practice. She walked alone to the entrance when she suddenly noticed a key lying on the floor and the gym door ajar. A dark sense of unease washed over her as Nana stepped into the dimly lit room. She tried to turn on the lights, but they seemed to be out of order. Determined to push past her fear, Nana decided to prepare for the upcoming swimming exam. She walked to the pool area, the dim lights reflecting off the water. As she approached the pool, she heard a nearby sobbing voice, that of a girl, weak and sorrowful. Nana stopped, looking around the area, but saw no one, and everything fell silent. The overhead lights flickered, distorting her vision for a moment. As she squinted, she saw a shadow floating at the far end of the pool. Her first thought was that it was a student practicing diving, as that occasionally happened. But as time passed, she realized that the shadow wasn't moving. A sense of unease welled up inside her, and she decided to check, just to be sure. Nana approached the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the floating shadow. As she got closer, fear surged within her. The water around the shadow began to darken, turning a deep crimson, and she realized with horror that a lifeless body was floating in the pool. Overcome with fear, Nana ran to seek help. Moments later, the police arrived to investigate. They confirmed that the body belonged to a student who had been seen alive just a day before. Nana suddenly realized it was Lee. Her mind was haunted by memories of her friend. She learned that her friend had been haunted by strange visions, driven mad by sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. Lee could not stand the pressure from many sides. It caused her to develop depression and pushed her to the brink. Nana stood at the school gate, watching the flickering lights of police cars fade into the distance. The storm had passed, but a chilling emptiness lingered in the air. She shuddered, haunted by thoughts of the ghostly figure and the cries she had heard. In the following days, Nana lay in bed, tossing and turning as she recalled haunting images. The pale face of her friend Lee, the bloody child, and the dark water lingered ominously in her mind. In her sleep, the voices of Lee echoed in her ears, pleading, desperate, and faint. With each passing day, they grew louder, resonating in her mind. The next morning, Nana walked through the school hallway, the world around her feeling dreamlike. She paused in front of the gym, staring at the closed doors before walking away. That night, Nana fell asleep. As she closed her eyes, she was pulled into another nightmare. She stood in the gym, surrounded by darkness. Lee's face appeared before her, eyes wide with fear as she reached out, as if wanting to say something. Then everything seemed to change. The water in the pool turned red, and she watched in horror as Lee emerged from beneath the surface, slowly rising as if trapped. Nana tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The next day, Nana's nightmare still haunted her thoughts. Each day was filled with a nagging feeling that she was overlooking something urgent, something dark that only she could confront. She knew she needed to understand what had happened to Lee to help her find peace. Nana dove into research, sifting through old-school records, searching for any information about unexplained incidents at the gym or pool. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon a small article about a tragic incident, the unsolved death of a young girl at the school many years ago. The report detailed how a female student mysteriously drowned in the pool, and witnesses claimed to have seen a crying child nearby, although no child was ever found. Through the faded articles and forgotten records, she discovered that a child had been abandoned at the school. The child had died under tragic circumstances, perhaps explaining why the girl's spirit wandered, trapped here. The more she read, the more Nana understood the connection. The spirit of the abandoned child, full of pain and loneliness, had latched onto isolated students. Lee had been haunted by this spirit, drawn in by her own sorrow. That night, Nana returned to the pool one last time, determined to confront the spirit and free her friend. The water's surface was unusually still, almost holding its breath. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, the ghostly form of a child, her wet hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale, hollow face. The child's eyes were dark and empty, locking onto Nana with a sharp, calculating gaze, as if probing her intentions. Nana opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but the child moved closer. Suddenly, the child's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a cruel smile. She reached out with her bony, skeletal hand, extending sharp fingers towards Nana like claws. Nana stepped back, fear rising in her stomach, but she held her ground. She could only follow her heart, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, I want to help you." To the child's spirit, the child's smile faded, her expression stiffening, as if she had heard these words before, words that ended in betrayal. The child's empty eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward, her hands clawing at Nana's throat. Nana stumbled back, but she stood her ground, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want to hurt you. I understand your pain." The child paused, her arms falling to her sides, confusion evident on her face. But then her expression twisted again, suspicion flickering across her features, as if she were battling memories of her own pain and betrayal. In desperation, Nana moved closer, her hand shaking but steady as she extended it. The child hesitated, her appearance wavering between anger and sadness, her expression softening as Nana's words seemed to touch something deep inside. For the first time, the child's expression softened into one of almost peacefulness, her anger dissipating as she released her grip, her form fading into a gentle light. After all, there was one more thing Nana had to do. In her dream, she remembered something that Lee had conveyed to her. Nana recalled being led by Lee to a forgotten corner of the locker room, where an old art portfolio lay hidden beneath a pile of sports equipment, covered in dust. When she was alive, whenever under pressure, Lee would paint vibrant children's paintings, cheerful expressions, and serene landscapes. Each painting was filled with warmth, completely contrasting the darkness that enveloped Lee in her final days. The following weekend, Nana went to the local orphanage, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She handed it to the director of the orphanage, explaining Lee's wishes. As she had promised, Nana had painted and written about their story to memorialize them, ensuring that no one would forget them. Nana returns to school. She reflects on her journey. The remaining echoes of the past have faded, replaced by a feeling of fulfillment. She has somehow helped bring peace to suffering souls. The Clown in the Tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it, his hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. but it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looked sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave." I don't know how. I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear, echoed through the school. I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, my steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again. Haunting on the midnight train, the town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
Are you sure about this, son?
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. It's just a train ride. I'll be back. The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like two eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling unnatural. As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
Jacob.
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
Jacob, come to me.
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. Just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
You can't escape, Jacob.
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
Help us. Save us.
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board, and there was only one way to break it, by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally freed. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive. The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Mysterious masked person. The house was peaceful under the moonlight, and it seemed like it would be a simple summer week without my parents. They trusted me to take care of everything, and so far, I had been enjoying video games, staying up late every kid's dream. Around 11 o'clock p.m., I was lounging on the couch, absorbed in my game. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. Hi. I frowned. Who was this? I asked, but the reply came instantly, mixed with irritation and aggression. You don't know who this is? I tried explaining that I had just gotten a new phone and lost my contacts, but the angry messages kept coming. I assumed it was a prank and put my phone on silent, returning to my game. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I was startled by a sound, a knock on the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was late, and I'd been alone for days. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I cautiously moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing, just an empty yard. But I knew I'd heard something. I pulled out my phone, intending to call my mom, when I noticed several unread messages from the same unknown number. The last one sent chills down my spine. I'm here. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I immediately tried to call my mom, but the screen flashed, no signal. No way. We always had good reception here. I ran to the back porch and listened. Maybe, just maybe, someone was crying for help. I had years of self-defense training, and despite the fear surging through me, I was ready to defend myself. This could be a setup, a trick. I grabbed an old baseball bat from the garage and stepped into the backyard. The night was eerily quiet, which made me even more uneasy. I walked toward the edge of the trees, sweeping through the shadows. I shouted into the night, trying to sound confident, demanding who was there and telling them not to mess with me. Suddenly, a flashlight flickered, shining straight at me from deep in the woods. Whoever was holding it was too far for me to see their face, but they were trying to get my attention. The light went out as quickly as it had come on, and the screaming started again, this time more desperate. I slowly made my way toward the spot where the light had appeared. As I got closer to the trees, my heart pounded louder than my footsteps. The woods were dense, with towering trees casting deep shadows. I knew I shouldn't be doing this, but I couldn't stop. I yelled out, asking where the person was. A voice answered from somewhere ahead, a faint whisper saying,
"Here, help me."
I stepped deeper into the woods. My grip tightened around the bat, and my legs felt heavy as I moved forward. I saw a figure. My voice trembled as I asked if it was the person calling for help. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it started moving. In a split second, I realized this wasn't someone tied up. This was someone alive, and they were running toward me. Panic surged through me, and something inside screamed at me to get away to save my life. I didn't know how, but I ran. I slammed the porch door behind me, locking it, then sprinted to my room, slamming the door shut. The knocking started again, first at the front door, then at the window. It was relentless, as if he was trying to break in from every corner. He wasn't playing anymore. He was hunting me. I heard the sound of glass shattering from the living room. My heart raced as I realized he was inside. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. He was looking for me. I hid behind the bedroom door, gripping the bat. I held on so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear his breathing just outside my door. The door creaked open, and I saw the wolf mask peeking out. He cautiously stepped inside, unaware that I was right behind him. In that split second, I swung the bat as hard as I could. It slammed into his head. He collapsed to the ground, and I didn't stop. I swung over and over until I was sure he wouldn't get up. The house was now quiet after the chaos. Inside, everything was still. The intruder in the wolf mask lay motionless on the floor, while I stood over him, panting, hands shaking as I gripped the bloodied bat. I stared down at the man, his body sprawled across the floor. The wolf mask, now cracked, still covered his head, hiding his face. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I had just done. My phone still had no signal, but I needed help. I needed to get out of there. I rushed to the landline in the kitchen, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I dialed 911. I struggled to find the words, pressing the phone tightly to my ear, trying to calm down. I glanced back at the hallway leading to my bedroom, terrified that the masked man would get up again. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence of the night. Red and blue lights flickered across the walls as the police car stopped in front of the house. Their grim faces approached the door as I shakily opened it. The officers stepped inside, examining the broken glass, the signs of a struggle, and finally, the man lying on the floor. One officer knelt down, checking for a pulse. He said, "You did the right thing," as if he had seen this horror many times before. They told me to sit down and breathe, but I couldn't focus on anything except that mask, the wolf mask. Why? Why did he choose to wear it? The unconscious man was lifted onto a stretcher. His mask still hadn't been removed. My mind was still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The next morning, I was at the police station. The officers asked me about the man, whether I had ever seen him before. I shook my head, explaining the messages, the strange knocks, and the wolf mask. Then, they told me his name was Thomas, and he had been on the run for years. A detective handed me a file filled with old newspaper clippings and photographs. The story they told me was chilling. Thomas had a disturbing past. Years ago, he had committed a series of home invasions in nearby towns. He would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines before making his move, and he always wore a mask to cover half his face. But it wasn't just any mask. The wolf mask had become his signature. In every report, survivors described the same thing. A tall man in a wolf mask, terrorizing families, always escaping before the police could catch him, until now. The final piece of the mystery was revealed when the detective, now more familiar with Thomas's case, explained why he chose the wolf mask. The detective slid a newspaper article toward me. It had a blurry photo of the wolf mask next to a headline that read, "Wolf Stalker Evades Capture." The detective said the wolf represented a predator, a cunning hunter. Thomas saw himself as the wolf, and his victims were the prey. It terrified me to think about how long he might have been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had been toying with me, like a wolf plays with its prey. That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the TV filling the silence. My parents wouldn't be leaving me alone for a long time after this. The mystery of why he wore the mask had been solved, but the fear of that night still lingered. I didn't know if I would ever feel truly safe again, but one thing I did know, I would never forget the image of that cracked wolf mask lying on the floor. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it, a door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. "Chase, wake up." The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had two exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, a man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. We met a crazy clown in the woods. In the summer of 2016, amid bizarre clown sightings across the USA, I stayed at our friend Milo's house, which bordered a dense forest. After a day of movies and snacks, we felt restless and decided to take a late-night walk. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the forest at 2 a.m., our conversation mingling with the sounds of the night. By 2:45 a.m., we reached a clearing with an old, creaky playground until Milo pointed towards the old restroom building. There, partially illuminated by our flashlights, stood a man in a tattered blood red clown suit. Unlike the playful clowns from childhood, this one was menacing. His face was pale, with smudged makeup and a wide, eerie grin. His hair was a tangled mess of red and black. Paralyzed with fear, we watched as the clown stared at us, his head tilted to one side. Then, he started walking towards us, slow but deliberate. Panic surged through us, and we instinctively backed away, trying to decide whether to flee or confront the figure. Suddenly, the clown broke into a sprint.
Help me!
That was all the motivation we needed. We turned and ran as fast as we could back towards Milo's house, the forest path a blur beneath our feet. After what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the forest and onto the road in front of Milo's house. We glanced back and saw the clown standing at the forest's edge, partially illuminated by the streetlight. He had stopped running but was still watching us, his sinister grin visible even from a distance. In his hand, he held a big rusty axe. We didn't wait to see what he would do next. We bolted into Milo's house, slamming the door shut behind us. Milo's parents were out of town, so it was just the two of us, alone and terrified. We gathered in the living room, each of us trying to catch our breath and process what had just happened. Milo turned on the front door camera, and we watched the screen in tense silence. The clown appeared at the edge of the frame, walking slowly down the street towards the house. He stopped in front of the gate, looking around as if searching for something. My heart sank as he approached the front door, his gaze fixed on the camera. He leaned in close, his face filling the screen, and made a series of grotesque, mocking gestures. He waved the knife slowly before stepping back and disappearing down the street. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep. The image of the clown's twisted grin and the knife haunted our thoughts. We didn't tell anyone about the encounter, fearing disbelief or ridicule. To this day, the memory of that night lingers, a chilling reminder of how a seemingly innocent adventure can turn into a nightmare. We often wonder what might have happened if we hadn't run back to Milo's house, and the unsettling question of who or what the clown continues to haunt us.